for the source sheet in the chat, and Hakham Sassoon.
Subject of a cherubim, to think about it, bifurcates in two different directions. They come together, and tonight I think we'll see how they come together. But first of all, so that we don't get confused, a few words about the two distinct definitions of cherubim. In the 6th century, Emperor Justinian criticized those Jews who deny belief in angels, which is such an interesting aside. He thought it was very important to believe in angels, and evidently there were some Jews who didn't think so. And then you ask, well, how important is it to believe in angels? And what do we mean when we say angels? So this is all introductory to one of the meanings of cherubim. The ancient rabbis had a different problem with the angels. Namely, on which day of the 6 days of creation were they created? This was of utmost importance to them. And some said, well, maybe early on in the week. And others protested and said, no, no, we don't want that, because then people will say they helped God in the rest of the creation. Push them further down. But somewhere in those 6 days, they had to have been created. So this was the concern. Evidently, there were people who thought that they existed, they pre-existed. It's an old pagan idea again. So the angels are problematic. They got in the way of many ideas that the rabbis were trying to foster. However, if you go back to the Bible, you will find that, with the exception perhaps of the book of Deuteronomy and Jeremiah, we don't never mention angels at all, many other books of the Bible do mention them. Genesis, certainly, and perhaps the earlier books talk about angels. The book of Judges, the earliest parts of Exodus, never in Leviticus or in any of the priestly writings. So what's the story? Some of the rationalists, including Maimonides, like to quote the verse from Psalm 104, which is appropriate. Today was Rosh Hodesh. Oseh mal'achav ruchot. God uses winds as his messengers, because the word mal'ach basically means messenger. And some argued that that is the meaning in the Bible. When it says that there was a mal'ach sent, it means a messenger. It doesn't mean there is a breed or a creature called a mal'ach that was created separately. It just means, yes, the Bible does talk of God's messengers, but that's what they are. We might later come to a quotation in Maimonides' guide where he says the forces of nature, they are God's angels. And he says, we must believe in the angels. And then when he's saying you must believe in the angels, people think you must imagine winged creatures. But then elsewhere he says, this is my definition of angels. So it's a very complicated topic. So where did these images come from of winged beings? From the scriptures. Interestingly, they're not called angels in most of the texts where they are described as having wings. In Isaiah, they're called seraphim, and in Ezekiel, cherubim. Sometimes chayot, living creatures. So this is all by way of introduction, because we are going to be looking at some of these biblical and rabbinic sources that talk about cherubim. What is the other folk, as it were? That's the sculpted cherubim. That's something else. So the first is the idea that there are angelic beings that are called cherubs. The other is there were definitely images of things called cherubim. So we'll try and keep them apart, but it's not going to be easy. But we shall see from the context which is intended. With that said, let's begin our first source. First question is, what are cherubim? First mention of them in the Bible is, of course, in Genesis 3:24, where the humans were turfed out of the Garden of Eden after they sinned. And it says, he cast the humans out. And to the east of the Garden of Eden, he stationed the cherubim and a sword, whirling and flashing, to guard the way to the tree of life. So in Hebrew it says, Cherubim, the cherubs, not cherubs, the cherubs. Person who reads this is supposed to know what cherubs are, just as he's expected to know what a garden is, what east means, what humans are, what a sword is, etc. No definition given. So the readership must have known how to understand this term. Commentators have very different ideas as to what it means. So the medieval commentators themselves didn't know what to make of it. Rashi says, Mal'achei Chabala, the cherubim are angels of destruction. Well, the word destruction certainly doesn't appear in the text, but perhaps because there was a sword involved, so he thinks that they were destructive. And the word cherubim to Rashi is angels, mal'achim, mal'achei Chabala. And he bases this on a statement in a midrash. Ibn Ezra, very different. Ibn Ezra says the word cherubim means images. Nothing more definitive than that. And what is the proof? At kerub mimshach hasochech. We're going to read this text shortly in full, or at least in extenso. So when we get there, we'll see what it means or doesn't mean. This was addressed to the king of Tyre, and he was told, you are a cherub. From the context, it looks as though this is a very complimentary honorific which is being given him, among many others. So he's being told, you are an angel. What is mimshach? Mimshach could mean very large. There's a Semitic word, Mashach. Others say it means anointed, which is much more common. The word Mashach, Vishemen, HaKodesh, and so on, which means had oil poured on the person or on certain articles of the sanctuary. So we're not sure what it means. And how does Ibn Ezra propose to prove from this verse that cherub just means an image? So it is presumed that because it's talking about a human being, so this is not an angel. So it means you are the very image of Mimshach HaSochech. You are the quintessence. So therefore, for Ibn Ezra, this proves that the word cherub is vague and it just means an image. Then another proof, Yechezkel also speaks about Rosh HaCherubim Vehu HaChaya Sheizkir Batechila. All this we're going to look at shortly. In Ezekiel chapter 10, the prophet says that the cherubim that I saw were actually identical with the Chaya that I discussed earlier, namely in the first chapter of Ezekiel. So therefore, how can a cherub also be a Chaya? It means the cherub just means the image. So when Ezekiel said, the cherubim are the Chaya, he meant the image I saw later was the very same image that I described as Chaya earlier. In these two verses, perhaps one could get away with such an explanation and saying that yes, you could translate it image. Elsewhere, though, we shall see it's not so easy. Perhaps Ibn Ezra thought he would extricate himself from something which is not very welcome to rationalists, to have to go into what are these beings, what are these creatures, they're not human, they're not divine, what are they supposed to be? Okay. Our next source, remember we're trying now to know what they are. So Rashi said they're angels. Ibn Ezra said the word cherubim just means images of what? Frightening images, he thinks. Perhaps the sword itself was the image, but they don't have much substance. Now we come to Psalm 18:11. Of course, there's a parallel in the book of Samuel, but I chose the verse in Psalm because it's slightly different and it's probably the better reading. He rode on a cherub, he flew through the air, he swooped on the wings of the wind. This is really a description of, by the psalmist, of God's help, speedy help, that he came very speedily to his salvation when he was in trouble. That's the image. So we have parallels here, the cherub and the wings of the wind, approximating again Psalm 104, which speaks of Mal'achav Ruchot, this equation between the winds and messengers. I'm not going to say angels. So here also, the parallel between the Ruach and the Cherubim. So we could either say that the cherub here is the wind or the cloud, some image to give an idea of, well, clouds scudding across the sky, perhaps. That was the idea behind it. So we haven't really found a clear, unambiguous definition of the cherubim. We can see how the different sources are trying from the references, from the extant references, to get an idea of what they are. Others tried to depict them or to describe them. First source we look at is Josephus. So he starts by describing not the angelic beings, not the cherubs of Genesis or of the Psalms, but the sculptures that King Solomon installed in his temple. That's what he is describing here. So he describes, first of all, the Oeditum, which was the inner sanctum of the temple, and he says that it was 20 cubits wide and pretty much 20 square. And then he says there were cherubs installed there, and they had wings. So he has some idea of what they looked like, does he not? He knows that they were sculptures, and he knows that they represented beings that had wings. And then, what is the climax of his treatment of the cherubs? As for the cherubim themselves, no one can say or imagine what they looked like. Some translate, no one can say or conjecture what they looked like. Now, that's extraordinary to say such a thing when he's just told us they were winged creatures. So the commentators say he means, did they have facial features? What else do we know about them except that they had wings? Were they birds? Were they bird-like? Were they griffin-like? And why did he say this? That nobody can imagine what they looked like. There's something behind Josephus's emphatic statement here. No one can say or imagine what they looked like. Again, perhaps some polemic is going on. Of course, in the Second Temple, as we discussed already before, there was no Ark and no cherubim of any kind, neither on the Ark nor the ones that flanked it in King Solomon's temple. So, of course, he had never seen them. He only knew what he'd read in the Bible, and he is saying the Bible doesn't tell us very much about them, except that they had wings. Now, at this point, I'm going to diverge for a second from the written text and to revert to something we spoke about previously, namely that Jeremiah prophesied there would be no more ark. It would have no place and would be removed from the whole religious scene. What we didn't talk about was the blueprint in the last chapters of Ezekiel. Very famously, from chapter 40 on, he describes a vision he had of a sanctuary. And that sanctuary is modeled loosely on King Solomon's temple, which he probably saw in his youth before the exile. Almost certainly he saw it. But it's not exactly King Solomon's temple. There are a lot of variations. But one of the most striking things is this, that he has a section that he calls the Holy of Holies, but he doesn't say anything about an ark. It means that he never saw the ark. Again, points to what we suggested last time, that after Jeremiah, they removed it, maybe at his behest or under his influence. So Ezekiel had not seen the ark and did not mention it and does not foresee it in his futuristic temple. This is highly significant. But I'm only saying it now because as early as that, there was no ark, and certainly in Josephus's time, which is 500 years later, he couldn't have known what those cherubs looked like. Okay, and now we come to the book of Ezekiel. A different vision that he had. You know, Ezekiel had a great penchant for what you might call vivifying dead matter. Inanimate objects came to life. You know, the resurrection, everyone knows he had this vision of bones and sinews all coming together, and then people rising from the dead. A great host of people. But also, he sees the temple furnishings taking on a kind of spiritualization. And he didn't think that God would dwell in the temple anymore, but moved away. And he describes how what we would call the Shekhinah, perhaps, the glory of God, departs from the temple. Because he describes what goes on in the temple, all the idolatrous practices and so on. And he says God is not going to stay here, for sure not. So he describes God's departure. That's what this second, the second text here is all about. Each had 4 faces. The first was that of a cherub. The second, that of a man. The third, that of a lion. And the fourth, that of an eagle. So these are creatures 4-faced. Then the cherubim raised themselves up, those same living creatures that I had seen by the river Kebar. When the cherubim moved, the wheels moved beside them. When the cherubim lifted their wings and rose from the ground, the wheels did not turn away from them. When the one halted, the other halted. When the one rose, the other rose. For the spirit of the creatures was in the wheels. Then the glory of the Lord left the temple terrace and halted above the cherubim. The cherubim lifted their wings and raised themselves from the ground. I watched them go with the wheels beside them. They halted at the eastern gateway of the Lord's house, and the glory of the Lord of Israel was over them. These were the living creatures I had seen beneath the God of Israel at the river Kebar, and I knew that they were cherubim. This is the text with the densest concentration of the word cherub, cherubim. So you'd think that this is the locus classicus to discover what they looked like. And yet, they're still somewhat elusive. Let's examine the main references more closely. He said that there were creatures who had 4 faces, facing the different points of the compass. And one face was that of a cherub, second that of a man. So he knew what a cherub's face looked like, and he expected his readers to know what a cherub looked like. So this is the closest we get to some kind of indication, if only by a process of elimination. We know that it didn't look like a lion's face, it didn't look like a man's face. But what is a cherub? What is a cherub's face? Who has ever seen a cherub to be able to say we know what a cherub looks like? In English, People say that child looks cherubic. What does they mean? They mean little innocent kid. But that's because in medieval paintings, cherubs were painted that way, as infants who looked pretty innocuous, not too mischievous, not like, goblins or things like that. So again, doesn't help us terribly, but we'll see later that this idea of a cherub having the face of an infant is a very old Jewish tradition. But it's not here. It's not clearly in this scripture. The next one is also from the book of Ezekiel, and this is that important text that Ibn Ezra quoted to prove that the word cherub just means an image. This is a prophecy addressed to the king of Tyre. Man, raise this dirge over the king of Tyre and say to him, this is the word of the Lord God. You set the seal of perfection. Full of wisdom you were, and altogether beautiful. You were in Eden, the garden of God, adorned with gems of every kind, sardine and chrysolite and jade, topaz, cornelian, green jasper, lapis lazuli, purple garnet, and green feldspar. Many of these stones are described in the priestly Torah as having been on the breastplate of the high priest. Not all, but very many of them. Your jingling beads were of gold, and the spangles you wore were made for you on the day of your birth. You were an anointed or vast. We'll discuss the word used here in a moment. Sheltering cherub. You were on God's holy hill, and you walked proudly among stones that flashed with fire. You were blameless in all your ways from the day of your birth until your iniquity came to light. Your commerce grew so great, lawlessness filled your heart, and you went wrong. So I brought you down in disgrace from the mountain of God, and I banished you, O you anointed cherub, from among the stones that flash like fire. Twice in this prophecy, King of Tyre is addressed as a cherub. Does this help us to get a better idea of what was meant by cherub? For Ibn Ezra, it doesn't tell us anything. It just means you are an image of something anointed. So it's like a blank, the word cherub, and it could mean anything, as long as you understand it as image. But that's not very likely. Did it mean a very innocent being? Perhaps that's what it meant. That would fit. Until he was corrupted. When he went into commerce, he became corrupted and he lost everything through that. Okay, let's go on. See if another of Ezekiel's prophecies will help us. We referred to the blueprint at the end of the book, where he describes or imagines a futuristic temple. And the descriptions are very detailed. In chapter 41, he describes some of the ornaments and decorations within his sanctuary. Cherubim and palm trees, a palm between every pair of cherubim. Each cherub had two faces. One, the face of a man looking towards one palm tree, and the other, the face of a lion looking towards another palm tree. Such was the carving round the whole of the temple. The cherubim and the palm trees were carved from the ground up to the top of the doorway and on the wall of the sanctuary. So whereas before he spoke of the face of a cherub, now he speaks of a cherub who has two faces, but he doesn't have the face of a cherub at all. One of the faces is the face of a man, and the other is the face of a lion. So what's cherubic about him? So there's something else. So a cherub is not simply someone who has the face of a cherub. A complete cherub would have the cherubic face and the rest of what a cherub is supposed to look like. But these cherubs, who were carved on the wall and on the doors, probably not in full relief, in what you might call bas relief, so there were only two faces, not four. It wasn't in the round, and therefore you could only have two, but no cherub face. And yet they're called cherubim. Curious. But little by little, maybe we're getting closer to the idea of how the cherub was imagined. More about cherubs as motifs in the temple decorations. This time, the Book of Kings. King Solomon's talking about, he carved cherubim, palms, and open flowers on them, overlaying them with gold, and hammering the gold upon the cherubim and the palms. Similarly, for the doorway of the sanctuary, he made a square frame of wild olive and a double door of pine, each half having two swivel pins. On them, he carved cherubim, palms, and open flowers, overlaying them evenly with gold over the carving. Did this have some significance, this motive of cherubim and palms, or was it just ornamental? He could have had lotus or acanthus or anything. His artisans thought that these images were decorative. Perhaps. We can't say. The Book of Chronicles is also describing King Solomon's temple, but as you know, the stories in Chronicles don't always agree or coincide with the descriptions in the earlier books of Kings. So it's important always to compare and look at each one and understand each one on its own terms. So the chronicler says, in the most holy place, he made two sculptured images of cherubim. Or, now this is a bit of a problem because the chronicler uses a word which is a hapax legomenon, doesn't occur anywhere else. So we can't look up any other verse to shed light on its meaning. We can only try and understand it from its context. And the rare word is tza'atzu'im. He says, Cherubim shenayim ma'aseh tza'atzu'im. Has anyone got any idea what tza'atzu'im might mean? In modern Hebrew, it means a toy, but that came about because of this word. So you'll see in brackets, we give an alternative translation, cherubim in the likeness of children. This is the rabbinic understanding. And overlaid them with gold. The total span of the wings of the cherubim was 20 cubits. A wing of the cherub extended 5 cubits. Okay, so all the measurements. And at the end, very important bits of information to help us visualize these things. Verse 13, the wings of these cherubim extended 20 cubits. They stood with their feet on the ground. The first time we hear they had feet. In Isaiah, the seraphim are said to have feet, but cherubim, no. But here, yes. Here we are told, and these are sculptures of them, and they have feet, facing the outer chamber. So they stood in the Holy of Holies, and that was in the west, and they faced eastwards, or to the temple, or as the translator puts it, to the outer chamber. Now we go back all the way to Exodus. That's where cherubs occur in the Torah for the second time. First time we saw it in Genesis. Make 2 gold cherubim of beaten work at the ends of the cover of the ark, 1 at each end. Make each cherub of 1 piece with the other, with the cover. They shall be made with wings outspread and pointing outwards, and shall screen the cover with their wings. They shall be face to face, looking inwards over the cover. So these don't look outwards towards the temple with their backs to the Holy of Holies. No, they face each other. Shall see that this was an issue for the rabbis, how to reconcile. It's true, it's not talking about the same cherubs. The ones that King Solomon carved and installed were freestanding, as you will remember from last time. We looked at those texts as well. And they stood on either side of the ark, and their wings, as it were, overspread the ark. Whereas in Exodus, the much smaller cherubs decorated the lid of the ark. They were not freestanding, and we don't know that they had feet, and they were certainly not standing on the ground. And they were facing each other. So very many discrepancies between the 2 sets of cherubim, but they're both called cherubim. So they must have had something in common. And the one thing we know they had in common was wings. Now we turn to the Talmud. Rabbi Nai said, in the name of Samuel, the cherubs stood miraculously and did not occupy any physical space, as it is stated. And 5 cubits was 1 wing of the cherub, 5 cubits was the second wing of the cherub, 10 cubits from the tip of its wings till the tip of its wings. So the width of the adytum was 20 cubits. So if each wing was 5 cubits, so 4 times 5 is 20. So you had only room for wings, not for the bodies. Accordingly, the wings of 2 cherubs standing side by side would occupy the entire 20 cubits width of the sanctuary. But if so, where, in what space were their bodies standing? Since their wings alone occupied 20 cubits, there was no room left in which their bodies could stand. Rather, one must conclude from the verse that the cherubs stood miraculously and did not occupy any physical space. Recently, I read a book by an Israeli author called Nathaniel Rubin, and the title was Mashe Elohim Lo Yachol, a very strange an inept title. It deals with the question of omnipotence in the Bible and indeed in Jewish tradition. And his basic argument is that this question, when it was brought up by medieval philosophers, the Jewish philosophers all said that God created the universe with certain laws of physics. And since that is his will, if the universe is to function, it has to function according to those laws. And if you say, well, does that mean God is unable to change those laws? For instance, the questions that they like to bring up were, can the past be undone? Can the past be reversed? And many, many other questions. And many of them said, it's not possible. We're not denying that God can do anything that he wants, but we are saying that within the framework and the laws as he has set them in motion, the laws of physics prevail. And it's not possible for two opposites to happen simultaneously. They had their favorite questions, and of course he fills the book with it. And he said, until the late 1500s, all the Jewish philosophers insisted on this. And the first one to reject it was a rabbi by the name of Menachem Azaria Fano, an Italian rabbi who was deep into Kabbalah. And he said, when we declare God is omnipotent, it means completely omnipotent. And some of the things that followed from that, other rabbis thought quite blasphemous. To say that God can create another God or can curtail his powers, all kinds of strange things. And yet, he argued that if you're serious and you believe God is omnipotent, then indeed he can also diminish that omnipotence at will. Okay, I don't want to get into this book. It's a very deep and quite a useful book on philosophy. He says that those who favored the idea that God is not bound by the laws of physics, this was the text they quoted. There were only 20 cubits. And yet there was room for matter that measured more than 20 cubits. In other words, the bodies of the cherubs plus their wings. And that's what it says here. Miraculously they stood. And this miracle is a miracle that defies the laws of physics. And I don't know how many times he quotes this in his book. He says, all those who said that omnipotence means that we have to believe that the laws of physics are not stable, but are contingent on, as it were, peremptory will or divine will, they quoted this story. So it's quite important because, as we'll see, almost all the rabbis unanimously rejected it. But we're coming to that. It's quite a dramatic sugya of the Talmud. Abaye objected to this proof. He said, perhaps they stood with their bodies emerging beneath their wings, like chickens, with their wings protruding above them from the same point in the center of their backs. If so, their bodies would stand beneath their wings and would not occupy any additional space. Rava also objected. Perhaps they stood so that this one was not next to that one, and the wings of the two cherubs overlapped, thereby allowing for the additional space occupied by their bodies. Achab Bar Yaakov also objected. Perhaps they were standing in a diagonal alignment from one another, the diagonally opposite corner. In this way, there would be enough space for their bodies and their wings. Hakham, son of Rabbi Joshua, also objected to this proof. Perhaps the width of 20 cubits stated in the verse refers only to the width at ground level, whereas the room widened at the top and was therefore able to accommodate both their wings and the width of the bodies, because the wings were at some height and not at ground level. Rav Papa also objected. Perhaps they were folding their wings somewhat. Since their wings were not fully extended, they did not actually fill the full 20 cubits of the sanctuary. Rav Ashi also objected. Perhaps their wings crossed over one another, so they did not occupy so much space. Well, this is really quite an onslaught against the idea that they stood by means of a miracle that defied the laws of nature. So it's very rare to have so many named rabbis attacking anything in the entire rabbinic corpus. So this really got under their skin, this idea of inventing a miracle which isn't there. And yet, as I told you, in the Middle Ages, some seized on this statement in order to somehow devalue the laws of nature and to create a kind of dichotomy between nature and miracle and supernatural. Anyway, the Gemara continues its focus on the cherubs. The Gemara asks, how were the cherubs standing? Rabbi Yochanan and Rabbi Elazar disagree about this. One says their faces were turned towards each other, and one says their faces were turned toward the house. Now, we can anticipate what's going to happen because we already saw that in one place it describes cherubs facing away from the Holy of Holies and towards the outer chamber. And another source speaks of cherubs facing each other. Now, the simple answer is that these were not the same cherubs. One were the cherubs on the lid of the ark, and the others were the freestanding ones that were very tall and flanked the ark but stood on the ground. So why would there have been felt to be any kind of contradiction here? Well, commentators say cherubs are cherubs. They have to have a certain configuration, and therefore it is a problem. Are they supposed to face each other or not? But because it's not obvious to us why it's such a difficult problem, we're going to skip some of it. Those who want to read it, it's very interesting, can read it. And we're going to skip all the way until the last few lines. So, one of the rabbis answered, they were angled sideways, so that they turned both to each other and towards the sanctuary. So they were neither exactly facing each other, nor were they facing directly the outer chamber, but they were at angles. So you could describe them as facing each other, sort of semi-profile, and you could also say, well, they were not exactly looking at each other because they were oblique. Then it quotes Onkelos the convert. Well, we all know about Onkelos the convert because his most famous for the Aramaic Targum of the Torah, which has always been attributed to him. But we never heard that he had also produced an Aramaic paraphrase or any paraphrase of Chronicles. So we don't know where this came from. Was it a book that's lost, or did he just say this and teach it independently of any great work of his? We don't know. But here he is quoted. Onkelos the convert said, the cherubs were of the form of children, as the verse says, and in the Holy of Holies, he made 2 cherubim of the form of children. Well, it doesn't say that explicitly. We saw the words are Maaseh Tza'atzu'im, but it's Onkelos who said that word means children. And this was very influential. We'll see that all the rabbis accepted it, and in popular iconography, you will see cherubs painted or depicted or even sculpted as little children. So that word Tza'atzu'im is the key. Now we look at another Talmudic source, Sukkah. There it's discussing the lid of the ark. It doesn't say how thick it was, does it? It just says, make a lid. So the Gemara is trying to discover what was the thickness of that lid. So, how can we derive the height of the cover? Well, maybe from the face of the cherub, for it is written, toward the cover shall be the faces of the cherubim. So in other words, they had faces, and perhaps we could say that the lid was the same thickness as the span of the cherubs' faces. Well, perhaps aesthetically, that would be very appropriate. Rabbi Acha bar Yaakov said there is a tradition that the faces of the cherubim were not less than a tefach, that is a hand's breadth. And Rab Huna also learned from here that the cover was a tefach high, because it had to be the same as the face of the cherub. And what is the meaning of the word cherub? Rabbi Abu said it means like a child, for indeed in Babylonia they call a child Rabia. So without appealing to the word Tza'atzu'im, he also knows of a tradition that the cherubs had the face of children. But probably it was not really based on an Aramaic word, but it was based on the old tradition of Onkelos, who lived long before Rab Abhu. Abaye said to Rab Abhu, but then how do you explain that which is written, the one face, the face of the cherub, the second face, the face of a man? We saw that in the book of Ezekiel. Now, if the word cherub means like a child, then the face of the cherub is the same as the face of a man. They're all human faces. So he answers, actually the word cherub does mean like a child. However, the prophet distinguishes cherub from man because man has a large face and a child has a small face. I don't know if large and small are exactly correct. The word is zutrita, and it could mean a child's face, an adult's face, okay? That's probably more correct. Now we come to the last section, their meaning. What was the significance of the cherubs that were sculpted and that adorned various parts of the sanctuary. So in the book of Samuel, it says, so the people sent to Shiloh and fetched the ark of the covenant of the Lord of hosts, who is enthroned upon the cherubim. What does this mean? Now here, you'll see that it's a huge, I would say, division between those who understand this to mean the one who, Yoshev, who rules over the angels, the cherubs, thinking of the angelic beings. Or you could say, since he's describing the Ark of the Covenant, perhaps he means that they believed that God actually dwelt upon those cherub sculptures, not describing some theophany, but imagining that God really dwelt on this throne. Again in the Psalms, hear us, a shepherd of Israel, who leads Joseph like a flock of sheep. Show thyself, you who are throned on the cherub. And there are 2 or 3 other places where God is invoked as the God who Yoshev Cherubim, enthroned on the cherubs. We will never be able, I think, to get to the bottom of this and to know what these authors and prophets really had in mind. Some scholars think that just as in the northern kingdom, they believed that God dwelt on the golden calf, as you know, that was the image, and this was very popular among some Israelites. So in Judea, they believed God dwelt upon the cherubs. These ideas that are very, very distant and far removed from where we are. And the reason we are so far removed is because many prophets intervened between those ideas and where we are at today. It is possible that some people really believed that. And we're not going to go through all the quotes again, because we looked at some of them, the early ones, which may have imagined that the divinity, as it were, dwelt in certain confined places. Certainly, the surrounding cultures had temples, and they thought that these were palaces where their gods lived and came to eat, and these were homes for them. Did King Solomon imagine that when he built his temple? We don't know. Again, scholars are divided on this. And the reason we can't be sure is because, as you know, the Book of Kings has very ancient parts, but it also was revised by what they call a Deuteronomist, someone who was a follower of the Book of Deuteronomy. And the Book of Deuteronomy, the Ark, as we saw, doesn't have cherubs, doesn't have gold, it's simply a box made of acacia wood. Also, the Deuteronomist added in the Book of Kings a very emphatic statement, which we saw also last time. Inside the ark, there was nothing but the 2 tablets of stone given to Moses at Horeb. And some scholars say, aha, you see, there was a belief that there were other things also kept inside the ark, not just the tablets. Maybe some images, maybe some magic material, who knows what they believed in. So a cleaning up job was done by the Deuteronomists throughout the Book of Kings. And this is very clear. And you can always see which parts are Deuteronomic, because the Deuteronomist is so deeply influenced by Deuteronomy that he quotes it very often. And the older language is very different. It speaks in other terms and with different ideas. So you need a scalpel to separate the older story from the later Deuteronomist revisions. What did it say before that? Did it say something else about the Ark? Did it say something else about beliefs that this was really God's house? They often say Bet Hashem, but we just think of it in, the Deuteronomic terms, which always says, the sanctuary upon which I will put my name. In other words, it is dedicated to God's name, but God isn't present there. This was the great revision of the Deuteronomist, and very emphatic again throughout the book of Deuteronomy. Some people call it the name theology. But what was there before? Did they believe that God dwells in the temple? We have to leave that with a very big question mark. It's impossible to reconstruct exactly what they believed and what was meant by these words, Yoshev HaCherubim. We don't know. Of course, Maimonides didn't like any of that. You have here a text from Maimonides and one from Nachmanides. And Nachmanides, the Kabbalist, seems to attach a very different meaning to these words, he who dwells upon the cherubim, and it seems to us almost corporeal, the way he describes it. God actually dwelt between the cherubim on the ark, confined in this place. Well, others say, no, he didn't mean that. He just meant there was a presence. Well, the prophetic idea is simply that when people went into the temple, it helped them concentrate and think about God. That was all. But God is everywhere. And we saw the prophecy of Isaiah, who went in the temple and then said, Miloch al haaretz kivodo, don't come here looking for God. He isn't here, he's everywhere. You cannot confine God. And the whole idea of a temple and confining God is really a pagan idea. And it's unfortunate that Nachmanides, under the influence of the Kabbalah, brought back so many of these ideas. We're not going to go through it. Everyone has it. They can read it at their leisure if they so desire. But that's where we'll have to leave the cherubim. We've tried our best to access some meaning that would give us a description, but all we can come away with is a rabbinic tradition insisted that the word sa'atzoim meant children. And so the face of a cherub meant a human child. The rest of them, we know they had wings, and some thought of them as angelic beings, those who believed that angels are a distinct class of creatures that were created on one of the 6 days of creation. Some sources definitely attest to that belief. Others seem to think of angels as not distinct beings, but just messengers, and God can use any of his creation, any part of his creation, as his messenger to carry out his will. And therefore, we don't have to posit the existence of beings called angels, but they were out there, and some modern scholars describe the cherubim as griffins, even arguing that it's the same letters. Griffins are known from other cultures, and they were beings that were partly human, partly bird, and partly animal. So there are plenty of them depicted in Assyrian reliefs, in Egypt, all over the East. They had griffins, and these griffins, they think, inspired the idea of cherubim, and because they were so well known, the Bible never had to describe them. But this is all conjecture. And we come back to Josephus, no one knows and no one can conjecture. Well, I think we have tried to conjecture it in spite of Josephus. Thank you.